He appears in the margins of a brittle page, a sketch of a man with a thick mustache, drawn in haste, his shoulders slightly hunched, a single annotation beside the inked face, the one who walks alone. The description is terse, almost forensic, but the surrounding lines smear into something else entirely, a sequence of images, a handful of coded dates, and a cluster of symbols that read like an obituary written in riddles. According to declassified Bulgarian files consulted by researchers, those pages are part of a set of visions attributed to Baba Vanga from the mid-1990s, and they allegedly point toward a decisive event affecting Nicolás Maduro in 2026. The language in the archive is spare and strange. The claim, when translated into a contemporary political map, reads as alarming, terrifying, some have said, allegedly prophetic, others insist. If this investigation intrigues you, please like and subscribe. It helps us dig deeper into documents like these and bring context that the headlines miss. Baba Vanga's name carries weight in certain corners of popular culture. Born in Bulgaria in 1911, she lost her sight in adolescence and became renowned as a clairvoyant, attracting visitors from across Eastern Europe and beyond. Stories of her hits, predictions that seem to foresee wars, assassinations, natural disasters, sit alongside a long record of vague pronouncements and post-event reinterpretations. To her admirers, she was a seer with an uncanny knack for naming futures. To skeptics, she was a skilled storyteller whose ambiguous imagery was easily retrofitted to events after the fact. That divided reputation is part of what makes any newly surfaced set of notes both magnetic and suspicious. The documents at the center of this story did not arrive via a polished academic release. They emerged as a patchwork, a stack of typed transcripts, a handful of handwritten notes, a few photocopies with redacted lines and marginalia in Bulgarian. The collection came from, or at least is claimed to have come from, the archive of an institution called the Bulgarian Institute of Paranormal Phenomena, an organization that, at least on paper, catalogued reports, interviews, and transcriptions associated with figures like Baba Vanga. Among the guardians of those files, one name recurs in researcher accounts, Dimitar Markov. He is described in the materials as a secretary and witness, someone who catalogued and, at times, testified about what was kept behind seals. Markov's testimony, as it appears in the released set, is cautious but consequential. He alleges that a particular folder, a compact, well-worn packet dated 1996, was sealed and later classified. His notes claim that portions of the material were withheld from public access following diplomatic inquiries from representatives of a foreign government.
The details in Markov's account are thin and framed with caution, yet they are the reason contemporary investigators began to pay attention. If accurate, they would explain why certain passages remained obscure for decades, and why, when they resurfaced, they did so as truncated excerpts and second-hand testimonies rather than pristine originals. What the files contain, if one reads them as they have been translated, is a patchwork of symbolic imagery, short-dated annotations, and what reads like shorthand commentary. The language is not a straightforward sentence-by-sentence chronicle. It is a seer's shorthand, evocative, elliptical, full of metaphors that demand interpretation. Researchers who study the set have tried to map those metaphors onto real-world calendars and political players. In that interpretive exercise, 3 images repeated across several pages have become the anchor points of the claim: a reference to the year of the water dragon, a notation marked undécimo mes, the 11th month, and a cluster of timing markers described as a week of 2 full moons that will be followed by 3 days of silence. Each of those elements carries both symbolic weight and practical complications. The water dragon motif appears several times, sometimes spelled out and sometimes encoded in a shorthand calendar notation. Within the file's internal logic, researchers argue, that phrase is tied to a particular year in the future. The set, as archived, points readers toward 2026. In another passage, the Spanish phrase undécimo mes is underlined and connected to a sequence of events described in metaphorical detail: flowers out of season, migratory birds changing their routes, and the mirror that takes away the face. Elsewhere, the transcripts note a week in which 2 full moons will occur, a celestial double that the archivists remind their readers can be checked against astronomical records. The files do not rely solely on symbolic language, but anchor certain claims in events that are theoretically verifiable. The most unsettling image is the trio of days, 3 days of silence, phrased in the pages as a silence like a held breath over a sleeping city, followed, apparently, by a sudden and massive movement of people dressed in white. The notes do not describe violence. On the contrary, the language highlights a kind of luminous public presence, a mass that acts with the force of ritual rather than the fury of war. Interspersed with those crowd scenes are smaller, intimate images: a man reflected in a mirror whose shadow seems detached from his face, a shoreline where someone steps into a boat and crosses to a place where the sun sleeps earlier, and a notation that a certain leader with a thick mustache will find a lake of his own undoing. The phraseology is cinematic and suggestive. When mapped onto contemporary names, it becomes incendiary.
Throughout these passages, the documents refer to international tremors as well, eagles from the north changing color, a line that archivists and commentators have read as a veiled allusion to shifts in U.S. foreign policy or posture. The files also make note of regional spillovers, of ripple countries to the west and south, and speak of economic seasons changing, as if nations themselves had metabolisms that could be awakened or chilled. That is the kind of sweeping, mythic language that has always been both Baba Vanga's appeal and her vulnerability to critique. Broad enough to be mapped onto many situations, specific enough in certain moments to invite a direct reading. We must be blunt about the nature of these materials. The narrative that links those images to Nicolás Maduro's future is built on interpretive leaps. The archive itself, as released, contains no single line that names a living political figure in crisp, unambiguous prose. Instead, the claim relies on cross-referencing three kinds of content: descriptive sketches, the mustached man; calendar annotations, the 11th month, the week of 2 full moons; and symbolic events, a leader leaving by water, crowds dressed in white. Researchers and investigative journalists who have worked with these documents say plainly that moving from those elements to the conclusion Baba Vanga predicted Nicolás Maduro's fate in 2026 requires a chain of inferences. That chain can be presented as plausible, even compelling to some. It is not, however, an airtight proof. The way the archive was cataloged, stamps, marginalia, the rulings that mark certain lines as sensitive, suggests that those who handled it thought the material had political potency. Markov's notes, for instance, emphasize the file numbers and a running list of who requested access between 1996 and the early 2000s. In one marginalia, he alleges that embassy channels made inquiries and that certain pages were excised before an official copy left the institute. Whether those excisions were done to protect individuals, to avoid diplomatic entanglement, or simply to remove embarrassing or unverifiable material is unclear. The alleged diplomatic pressure, whatever its motive, is central to why investigators see the unredacted set as carrying a different weight than the partial excerpts that circulated earlier on the internet. Context matters enormously here. Venezuela's modern political trajectory, its economic collapse, waves about migration, and highly contested elections provides a combustible backdrop against which any vaguely predictive text can be read as revelation. The file's imagery of a nation of black gold and a leader who is eventually crossing waters resonates with the Venezuelan story in elemental ways. Yet the archive was not produced in a vacuum.
It emerged in the mid-1990s, a period of global political realignments, and it speaks in the idioms of a different era: the post-Soviet anxiety, the Balkan aftershocks, the transnational movement of seers and their testimonies. Interpreting those images across decades and across political systems that shift and recast themselves requires imaginative work that can be both productive and dangerous. There is another, more technical layer to consider. The files themselves blend genres. Some pages are straight transcriptions, a question from an interviewer followed by a recorded phrase, while others are archivist notes, shorthand summaries, or later annotations by scholars who studied the material. That heterogeneity complicates the question of provenance. Which words can legitimately be attributed to Baba Vanga or to the person transcribing her, and which are editorial glosses added by later hands? In several cases, lines that appear to be part of the original are followed by bracketed notes in a different hand, suggesting an interpretation or an attempted clarification. The cumulative effect is a text that reads partly as prophecy and partly as commentary on prophecy. For viewers who weigh prophetic claims against empirical standards, there is a helpful technical point embedded in the archive itself. The files include references to astronomical events, specifically a week of 2 full moons and a partial eclipse, that are, by their nature, verifiable. That is not an incidental detail. If one accepts the files as a contemporaneous document with defined calendar references, those celestial notes could be cross-checked against astronomical records to test consistency. In other words, not every claim in the set is purely symbolic. Some of the elements are anchored to measurable phenomena. Investigators stress this as a method. Verify what can be verified first,
then consider the more symbolic language. When researchers did that work, they concluded that certain astronomical events described in the transcripts could be matched with actual lunar cycles and eclipses that coincide with modern calendars. The file's notation of 2 full moons in 1 week is unusual but not impossible under certain configurations, though the phrasing in the archive is not always precise enough to guarantee a single calendar mapping. The cautious conclusion was this: some elements can be checked, others cannot. The combination of verifiable and symbolic claims creates an illusion of certainty, enough empirical anchor points to make the rest of the imagery feel more credible in the reader's mind. That blend of the concrete and the symbolic is a familiar structure in prophetic literature. It is also a rhetorical device. By pairing a specific, checkable detail with a sweeping, ambiguous image, the document invites readers to make the leap from "this could be true" to "this must be true."
Consciousness of that rhetorical architecture is essential for any fair reading. It is also why the archive, however it came to light, has had such an electrifying effect on both believers and critics. The moment the files leaked into public view, commentators on both sides of the political spectrum began to supply names. The "mustached man" sketch quickly acquired a contemporary referent. Analysts noted physical resemblances and political alignments, and mapped the "black gold" line onto Venezuela's oil-rich identity. The mention of a successor compared to Joan of Arc was read as an explicit reference to a charismatic female opposition figure, and the name Maria Corina Machado began to circulate in analysis and social media. Again, the documents do not offer an explicit name in the way of a press release. They offer an archetype. Yet within a charged political context, archetypes become accusations, and riddles become roadmaps. It is important here to underline 2 ethical and methodological guardrails. First, when a living political figure is implicated by inference in a prophetic text, that implication must be characterized as just that, an implication, not a verdict. The archive can be described as allegedly pointing toward a confrontation involving a mustached leader, but it cannot be permitted to function as a legal or moral indictment. Second, prophetic language is often metaphorical by design. Treating metaphors as literal reporting is a category error. The document's evocative phrases, "mirror with shadows," "multitude in white," "3 days of silence," are dramatizations of a narrative logic, not a courtroom testimony. Still, the more one sits with the pages, the more concrete some turns of phrases feel. One passage, wrapped in the kind of italicized handwriting that suggests urgency, describes a leader who sees himself in a mirror and the face is not the same. Beside that line, an archivist later wrote, "Loss of mirror, loss of legitimacy." Another entry, perhaps the most cinematic, details a shoreline scene, a small boat, a man boarding, a movement away from the mainland toward the setting sun, an image that readers easily map onto exile by sea. The combination of private moments and mass choreography, a leader alone at the mirror and crowds in white on the streets, creates a narrative arc that is dramatic even without modern headlines to tie it together. Those same pages, however, are careful to note alternative readings. In one marginal note, an archivist warns symbolic language could be internal political shift or economic rebalancing. That caveat appears repeatedly in the set. Where the scribe could have left plain proclamations, they instead folded multiple potential meanings into brief parenthetical notes. That practice, while perhaps frustrating for those seeking a single truth, is valuable because it resists a one-to-one mapping that could be politically destabilizing.
It invites a plurality of interpretations. Maybe the 3 days of silence signals a communications blackout. Maybe it is a metaphor for political apathy. Maybe it is literal. The document's own structure seems to acknowledge that the prophetic genre trades in probabilities rather than certainties. Against this textured background, a pattern emerges in how the archive was handled and how its contents were then narrated in public. First came the leak of a handful of pages that highlighted the mustachioed sketch and the water dragon note. Those snippets, circulated on social media and in tabloids, read like a sensational film logline. A blind seer named a year and sketched a face, and the face bears a resemblance to a sitting leader. Second, investigative journalists and documentary teams pushed back with more careful readings, talking to archivists, astrophysicists, and political historians. They tried to place the dates, verify the astronomical claims, and track the provenance of the paper. Third, partisan commentators seized on the parts that fit their narratives. For opponents, the archive reads as a hopeful prophecy of imminent change. For defenders, it is a piece of manipulated fiction designed to destabilize confidence. None of this is surprising. Political contexts are not blank slates upon which prophetic documents fall.
They are already charged narratives that make certain images resonate more strongly. Still, for all the noise, the careful work of cross-referencing, checking the paper, analyzing the handwriting, consulting astronomical tables, yielded a mixture of confirmations and unresolved questions. Some paper stock matched what an Eastern European institute would have used in the mid-1990s. Some signatures bore connections to known clerks. Some redactions could be explained by routine classification practice. Yet gaps remained. Entire pages were missing, and the chain of custody from the institute to public hands was at best irregular. What emerges in the early investigative phase is as much a study of pattern-seeking as it is of prophecy. Humans are experts at connecting dots. The archive provides dots that are tangibly there and some that are evocative. When those dots are aligned with current reality, a stagnant economy, a contested election, a charismatic opposition leader, they form a line that looks like prediction. That line, however, is only as strong as its weakest link: the redacted pages, the hand-applied annotations, the interpolations by later readers. If one accepts that the chain of inference is necessarily interpretive, then the file's claim can be seen as a prompt rather than a decree, a prompt to examine, to verify, to imagine alternate outcomes. Even as investigators parsed the transcripts, other kinds of evidence were layered onto the story: local reports, witness statements, and natural phenomena that in the files are presented as preludes.
The archive lists birds changing routes and flowers that bloom out of season in a sequence connected to the undecimo mess. That language reads like folklore, omens in a natural world that readers are invited to take as signs. Researchers who followed up with ecologists and aviary specialists found that migratory patterns can, in fact, alter due to climatic shifts, but that attributing a specific migration to a single political event is speculative. The point is not to dismiss the observations; migratory anomalies do occur, but to underscore that reading them as premonitory tokens requires caution. There is an important procedural note hidden in these discussions. The files themselves encourage independent verification. When an image, such as 2 full moons in a week, is invoked, the documents append a short technical note: astronomical facts can be verified. In practice, that means the responsible approach to these texts is to separate the verifiable from the symbolic, to test what can be tested first, and to treat the evocative sequences as interpretive possibilities rather than deterministic scripts. As the investigators pursued those verifiable threads, the contemporary political backdrop only grew more pertinent. By 2024, Venezuela's political calendar had been a gauntlet of contested votes, external sanctions, and a humanitarian crisis that sent millions abroad. Protests ebbed and flowed, rumors of elite fracture circulated, international actors shuffled positions. In that setting, a prophetic archive that speaks of a peaceful unraveling, of soldiers lowering their arms, and of a mass movement completed without violence, read as both an alluring hope and a potential vector for manipulation. It is here, in the intersection between archive and present, that the narrative becomes ethically charged. If one believes in good faith that a nonviolent transition is possible, then a prophetic text that sketches such an outcome becomes a balm, a hopeful roadmap. If conversely, one sees the same text as a piece of political theater, a planted narrative designed to erode morale or sharpen divisions, then it is a weapon. The archive itself cannot adjudicate between those readings. Its job, if you will, is to offer images that others will enlist for their purposes. Part of the intrigue and part of the danger lies in the way the files articulate a sequence. The archival notes read like a script in which certain elements function as triggers: subtle natural phenomena, an astronomical oddity, a period of quiet, and then a sudden mobilization. Each trigger taken alone is ambiguous. Together, woven into a sequence, they produce a sense of inevitability. It is not hard to see why that linearity appeals to those who long for change. It maps out a path that bypasses violent upheaval and points to a rapid healing.
The same linearity alarmingly suggests to others that events might be choreographed or that the archive is being used to prime expectations. To ground the abstract in human terms, the files intermittently insert small, intimate vignettes that humanize the drama. One passage imagines a woman standing in a plaza as the sky brightens, her hands full of fruit offered to the crowd, her white dress catching the light. Another fragment shows a soldier, fatigued and alone, removing his helmet and laying it at his feet, as if offering it to the earth. These vignettes accomplish two things. They transform symbolic mass movements into scenes that are emotionally accessible, and they deflect a reading of the archive as purely strategic. Whether that humanizing effect is manipulative or empathetic depends on the eye of the reader. As the first major public accounts of the file circulated, scholars and commentators began to stress methodology over melodrama. Historians cautioned against retrospective attribution, the human tendency to read past texts as foretelling present events after the events occur. Psychologists pointed to confirmation bias. Given a smudged sketch of a mustachioed man, most people will see a familiar face if they already suspect a connection. Media analysts warned that in the digital age, a half-leaked archival line could ricochet through social platforms and become, by sheer repetition, an accepted narrative. Yet skepticism has its limits. The human cost of long political crises cannot be reduced to a debate over authenticity alone. If the files, even in their uncertain form, provide a framework that encourages peaceful mobilization and a nonviolent transition, some will argue that the moral calculus favors attention. That argument is persuasive to those who prioritize outcomes over evidentiary purity. If an archive, however fuzzy, produces a movement that averts bloodshed and accelerates recovery, its provenance becomes a secondary concern. That is a consequentialist reading, and it is important to acknowledge its existence even as we maintain methodological standards. The early chapters of this investigation end, for now, at a hinge. The archive gives us fragments that can be verified and images that cannot. It names shapes rather than names. It offers a year and a sequence rather than a manifesto. Researchers have done what they can. They have tested the astronomical notes, traced the paper, interviewed the custodians, and followed the marginalia. They have also cataloged the parts that remain murky, the redactions, the missing pages, the diplomatic whispers that shadow certain passages. What comes next, if one follows the logic of the archive's narrative, is the urgent section, the description of 2026 itself. The files build towards an intense sequence, the prelude of signs in the months leading up to the 11th month, the week of 2 full moons, the 3 days of silence, and then a public crescendo.
But before we lay out that crescendo as though it were a script unfolding according to a divine clock, we must pause and consider what is at stake in translating allegory into expectation. The documents call for a careful reading. The present calls for prudence in action and in interpretation. There is a moral responsibility in how one frames prophetic material, especially when it can influence people's hopes, fears, and choices. At the end of the declassified passages is a line that circulates quietly among the archivists. When the mirror breaks, a people see themselves for the first time. It is the kind of line that feels designed to live on the edge between poetry and prophecy. If one reads the files as a call for attentiveness to natural signs, to political fractures, to the possibility of nonviolent change, then that sentence reads as an exhortation rather than a prediction. If one reads it as a forecast of an inevitable turning point, then the document becomes a timetable. This tension between exhortation and timetable, between evocative metaphor and ascertainable fact, is the engine of the story. It is why the archive has captivated so many, and why it remains controversial. For the moment, the record is partial, and the chain of inference remains interpretive. The pages we possess invite us to look closer, to verify what is verifiable, to test what can be tested, and to hold hypotheses lightly. What follows from here is a close examination of the file's core sequence, the recorded signs, the alleged timing markers, and the images that together constitute the archive's proposed template for 2026. Those details will demand both rigorous checking and humane reflection, a balancing act between the appetite for revelation and the responsibility to avoid fueling a panic or a false hope. The documents give us a map made of metaphors. The task for anyone who takes them seriously is to translate that map into sober inquiry. If the archive proposes a script for 2026, it begins with a long, patient prologue, months, the files say, of small, uncanny disturbances that most people would dismiss as weather or coincidence until a pattern becomes visible. According to the declassified pages, the undecimo mes is preceded by 11 months in which certain signs gather like clouds. Birds alter their routes, flowers bloom outside their season, markets shudder and then steady, and a low-level diplomatic realignment makes headlines one week and disappears the next. These are not thunderclaps, they are murmurs. The files present them as precursors, subtle signals that, when read together, indicate an approaching hinge. The transcripts catalog those precursors with an almost anthropological attention to detail. There are repeated entries about avian movement. The migratory paths change, a note reads, followed in another hand by a partiary bracket. Could be climate, verify.
Elsewhere, a line notes flowers in winter on the plaza and pairs it with a calendar entry. For investigators, these are not sufficient on their own to justify a prophetic reading. For citizens living with scarcity and fear, small anomalies are magnified.
A tree in bloom in a month when it ought not to flower is no small comfort. The archive seems to understand that nuance. It pairs natural oddities with calendar markers that can, in principle, be checked. Those astronomical markers are perhaps the file's most auditable claims. The manuscripts point to a week in which 2 full moons occur, and to the presence of a partial eclipse near the same period. Astronomers can and do test these specific claims. A lunar calendar is indifferent to political intentions. Independent checks, available to anyone with the dates, can confirm whether the celestial events line up with the archivist's reading. That the documents themselves invite such an empirical test is notable. They do not demand blind faith. Astronomical facts can be verified, a marginal note reminds the reader. If you want to parse the prophetic language responsibly, start there. The files then compress those 11 months into a single charged interlude, a week of 2 full moons, followed by 3 days of silence. The imagery of those 3 days is layered and precise in its ambiguity. On the one hand, the archived shorthand describes silence as a held breath over a sleeping city, a phrase that reads like a novelist's flourish. On the other hand, the transcripts note practical possibilities, communications blackouts, curfews, a pause in public gatherings. Investigators have suggested 3 plausible readings: a literal communication shutdown, a political lull as actors wait for a signal, or a metaphor for a sudden suspension of public dissent. The texts refuse to choose. They offer the silence like a hinge and leave us to feel the weight of it. According to the set, what follows the silence is not chaos, but choreography. The pages recount in repeated variations the sudden arrival of crowds dressed in white, not in riot gear, not in uniforms meant to conceal identity, but in a color that carries its own symbolic freight: purity, mourning, or a civic declaration of unity. The imagery is cinematic. Plazas filled like a tide of linen, hands raised not as weapons, but as instruments of witness. Archivists add contextual notes suggesting nonviolence, movement like ritual, one reads, and the files emphasize that the Mass is peaceful. It is worth repeating, the archive frames the sequence as a nonviolent unfolding. The seer's shorthand zooms between Mass and intimate images. A recurring vignette in the files places a leader before a mirror. The entry is terse: mirror with shadows, the face no longer answers.
That line, when investigators and commentators mapped the sketch of the man with the thick mustache onto political figures, became one of the archive's most combustible moments. The transcripts do not supply a name, they supply a moment, a man confronting the instability of his reflection. Later marginalia reads, loss of mirror, loss of legitimacy. The image of a leader alone with his reflection, the files imply, is an almost archetypal moment, authority confronted by its own unraveling. The shoreline image follows. The papers contain multiple variations of a short description: a small boat, a crossing toward the sun that sleeps earlier. Archivists render it as an exit by water in their clarifying notes. Taken together, the silence, the white-clad crowds, the mirror broken by shadows, the departure across water, the archive offers a dramatic arc that reads to many as the peaceful exit of a leader and the beginning of a new chapter. In the contemporary mapping that linked the sketch to Nicolás Maduro, this arc is read as the seer's alleged forecast for 2026, a period of signs, a silent prelude, a mass assertion, and an exit that is not marked by blood but by passage. The documents extend the arc beyond the departure. They contain hopeful scenes of aftermath, markets reopening, buses returning loaded with people who had left years before, negotiators at tables trading keys and economic plans rather than bullets. There are notes of rapid recovery, accompanied by a list-like set of metaphors. The garden grows back. Black gold returns to the nation's hand. Neighbors follow. These are the file's most optimistic pages. Researchers point out that they are also the most politically freighted. Talk of rapid economic rebound and regional domino effects reads not just as ecological metaphor, but as a forecast of geopolitical opportunity. Again, the archive frames these as possibilities rather than certainties, part prose, part wish. Embedded in the files is an image that has become a focal point in public discussion, a successor figure described with martial and spiritual overtones, compared in one line to a Joan of our coasts. Archivists append a cautious note: female leader archetype, could be many. Still, in the fever of political analysis, that archetype became associated with specific opposition figures, and Maria Corina Machado's name appeared frequently in commentaries and social feeds.
The documents do not explicitly name her. They present a template, a female successor embraced by the people, sanctified in public imagination, and capable of catalyzing rapid policy shifts. For investigators, the ethical guideposts are clear. Any such linkage must be treated as inference, not indictment. If the files outline a dramatic sequence, the question then becomes, how plausible is the choreography? The archive itself and the testimony of Dimitar Markov as the alleged custodian suggest both fragility and potential potency.
The transcript's chain of custody is not pristine. The paper trail is interrupted by redactions and missing pages. Markov's statements about diplomatic inquiries hint at why certain passages were obscured. The suggestion of external interest, of embassy channels concerned enough to request excisions, is one reason why the released fragments have been read as more significant than their partial nature might warrant. If those annotations are accurate, they imply that someone believed the material could influence international perceptions. Political realities in Venezuela make the archive's hypothetical sequence more than a literary exercise. The nation's economy, civic fabric, and military loyalties have been under stress for years. That context is precisely why a set of metaphors about nonviolent transition resonates so loudly. If soldiers lower their arms because their morale has shifted, if sections of the elite choose negotiated exit over ruin, and if a successor manages to marshal international goodwill for reconstruction, the file's optimistic pages map onto tangible pathways. But those pathways require coordination, willingness, and trust, ingredients in short supply in polarized contexts. The prophecy, even if genuine, would be only one factor among many. There is a geopolitical dimension the archive touches on indirectly. The "Eagles from the North" changing color line has been read as a nod to shifting policies among global powers. In the past decades, external actors have alternated between confrontation and engagement with Venezuelan authorities. The files suggest that international posture might act as a trigger or a permissive condition for domestic transition. Changes in U.S. policy, shifts in regional alliances, or new diplomatic openings could create breathing space for domestic actors to act. None of these conditions are sufficient on their own. They are ingredients. The archive, once again, offers a list of possibilities rather than a schedule. Reading the files soberly, one must reckon with an uncomfortable truth about prophecy and public life. Whether or not the predictions are authentic, their existence influences behavior. Leaked or publicized prophetic documents can become performative. They can prompt actors to align their moves with the narrative. That is one of the archive's ethical difficulties. If the file functions as a kind of script, it could inspire real-world attempts to realize the story, for good or ill. This is why responsible journalism, historical method, and civic prudence matter. Prophetic documents that flirt with political futures cannot be treated like folklore. They have material consequences. Counter-arguments to the archive's reading are numerous and deserve sustained attention. Historians warn against teleology, the impulse to view past fragments as inevitable foreshadowing of present events.
Psychologists point to confirmation bias. Given a smudged likeness of a mustachioed figure, a viewer in a politically fraught moment is likely to map it onto a familiar target. Media scholars emphasize the viral mechanics of half-leaks. A partial excerpt can, by repetition, achieve the social weight of an established narrative. Disinformation analysts add another layer. Documents can be crafted, seeded, and amplified to produce strategic effects. Any of these mechanisms could be at work with the Vanga materials. There is also a subtler interpretive caution. Prophetic language operates metaphorically. The archive's mirror with shadows could be a literal portrait of a leader's crisis of identity, or it could be shorthand for a broader institutional failure. The week of 2 full moons might map to a rare set of political alignments rather than to astrophysical events. Conflating metaphor with timeline undermines careful analysis. The files encourage multiple readings, and the responsible reader must hold competing hypotheses simultaneously. Perhaps the documents anticipate a real sequence. Perhaps they are a Rorschach for the present. Perhaps they are deliberately ambiguous to protect the seer and those around her. Yet the archive's most ethically urgent feature is not the question of authenticity, it is the possibility of a peaceful resolution. Across the pages there is a recurrent ethical tone, a preference, if not a prescription, for nonviolence and reconstruction. Whether one credits Vanga's visions or not, the image of a popular transition that averts bloodshed and prioritizes rebuilding is not merely poetic, it is a civic aspiration. That is why some commentators have argued that the document's existence could function positively, as an imaginative template for nonviolent action, even if the prophetic claims remain unverifiable.
If we step back from the symbolic to the human layer, the archive's strength is its narrative empathy. The small scenes, the vendor returning to her stall, the migrant at the dock kissing the land, the soldier placing his helmet down as if to say, enough, transform political abstraction into lived states. These vignettes are not calls to arms, they are reminders of what is at risk and what might be regained. The files, in the end, are as much about people as about power. For many who have endured scarcity and exile, a prophetic vision of return is a moral resource as much as a prognostic one. So where does this leave us in practical terms? First, treat the prophetic claims as archival allegations, evocative, serious, but not confirmed fact. Second, verify what can be verified, the astronomical notes and any ecological or migratory data referenced in the texts. Third, interrogate provenance. Follow the paper trail, the chain of custody, and the testimony of alleged custodians such as Dimitar Markov with skepticism and rigor.
Fourth, consider motive. Why might fragments have surfaced now, and who benefits from particular readings? These are not cynical questions, they are necessary ones. There is one more dimension we cannot ignore, the moral choice we make in responding to predictions. Do we weaponize them for partisan advantage? Do we treat them as gospel? Or do we use them as invitations to build a different kind of politics, one that prioritizes negotiation, human dignity, and nonviolent transition? The files, read charitably, seem to lean toward the latter. They imagine exit without carnage, markets reopened, neighbors welcomed home. Even if the visions are allegory, the ethical charge they carry is concrete. As we close this investigation, it is important to reiterate the core claim that launched this inquiry. According to the declassified Bulgarian files now circulating among investigators and on social platforms, Baba Vanga allegedly foresaw a decisive event affecting Nicolás Maduro in 2026. That is the central narrative engine we have followed, presented throughout with the caveat that these are archival allegations dependent on interpretation. The files supply images, the water dragon motif tied to the year 2026, the undécimo mes, the week of 2 full moons, the 3 days of silence, the white-clad multitude, the mirror with shadows, and the shoreline departure. Taken together, under some readings, they sketch the possibility of a peaceful transition and a rapid, hopeful aftermath. But possibility is not destiny. The archive invites attention and prudence in equal measure. It asks us to verify what can be verified, to resist the seduction of pattern without proof, and to prioritize human safety over triumphalist narratives. If these pages spur citizens and leaders toward dialogue instead of violence, toward restoration instead of revenge, then their moral effect may be positive regardless of provenance. If they are exploited to manipulate sentiments or to destabilize fragile institutions, then their danger is plain. We do not know whether the alleged prediction will prove prescient. We can, however, act on what we do know, that the material exists, that it has moved public discourse, that it contains verifiable elements worth checking, and that its symbolic heft is already influencing imagination. In the final measure, these declassified pages ask a larger question of us all. When confronted with a narrative that promises sudden change, how do we balance hope with caution, desire with evidence, and the ache for justice with the need for restraint? If you have read this far, share your perspective below. What did you find most compelling? The astronomical anchors, the human vignettes, or the archival mystery itself? Share this video and leave your thoughts below. We read them with respect. Subscribe for more deep dives.